Imagine, if you will, a world lost to the mists of time, a world long before the first stone was ever shaped into a tool, long before the first flicker of a controlled fire danced in the darkness of a cave, and eons before the first word was ever whispered by a human tongue. This is a world of shadows, of primal survival, and of a sensory landscape so rich and overwhelming that we can barely conceive of it today. We are going back 10 million years to the late Miocene epoch. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth, blooming tropical flora, and the heavy, sweet aroma of ripening fruit. In this lush, verdant canopy, our distant ancestors, great apes that would eventually give rise to the human lineage, spent their lives navigating the complex architecture of the trees. But something was changing. The climate was shifting, the great forests were thinning in places, and a new, invisible force was beginning to shape the very fabric of our biology. This force was fermentation.
It is a story that has been hidden in our DNA for millions of years. A secret history of our species that suggests our relationship with alcohol didn't start with the invention of farming or the first clay pots of the Neolithic. Instead, it began as a desperate, brilliant adaptation for survival in a changing world. For a long time, historians and archaeologists believed that alcohol was a relatively recent discovery, a byproduct of the agricultural revolution roughly 10,000 years ago. The story went that once humans settled down and began growing grains like barley and wheat, they accidentally discovered that soggy bread or stored grain could ferment into a crude form of beer. But recent groundbreaking discoveries in genetics and _0_ have completely shattered this timeline. We now know that the _1_ isn't about when we started brewing, but about how our bodies were pre-adapted to seek out and process ethanol long before we were even human. But before we dive deeper into the ancient science and the genetic mysteries of our past, I have a quick question for you, the viewer. If you could travel back in time and share one modern drink, anything from a craft beer to a vintage wine or even a simple soda, with an ancient ancestor sitting by a Paleolithic fire, what would it be? And more importantly, what do you think their reaction would be to that first sip? Let me know in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to see your theories on how that first happy hour might have looked. Now, back to the Miocene. The key to this entire mystery lies in a single enzyme known as ADH4, alcohol dehydrogenase 4. In our modern bodies, this enzyme is part of a sophisticated cleanup crew that breaks down alcohols that might otherwise be toxic. For decades, scientists assumed that all primates had a similar, albeit weak, ability to process ethanol. However, a landmark study led by geneticist Matthew Carrigan changed everything. By resurrecting ancient proteins from various points in our evolutionary tree, Carrigan and his team found something startling. Around 10 million years ago, a single point mutation occurred in the ADH4 gene of our common ancestor with chimpanzees and gorillas. This wasn't just a minor tweak, it was a massive upgrade.
This mutation made the enzyme 40 times more efficient at breaking down ethanol. To put that in perspective, before this mutation, our ancestors would have been poisoned or severely incapacitated by even small amounts of fermented fruit. After the mutation, they could consume it, process it, and, crucially, derive calories from it. But why did this happen? Why would nature suddenly favor the quote 5 of the primate world? The answer lies on the forest floor. As the dense forests of Africa began to give way to more open woodlands and savannas, food became harder to find in the safety of the treetops. Our ancestors were forced to spend more time on the ground, searching for fallen fruit. In a tropical environment, a fruit that falls to the ground doesn't stay fresh for long. Yeast, which is omnipresent in the environment, quickly colonizes the sugary flesh of the fruit, converting its sugars into ethanol.
This is the process of natural fermentation. To a primate without the ADH4 mutation, a pile of fermenting figs or marula fruit was a hazard, something that would make them sick or leave them vulnerable to predators. But to the ancestor with the mutation, it was a goldmine. Ethanol is incredibly calorie-dense. By being able to eat the fruit that others ignored or avoided, our ancestors gained a massive competitive advantage. They weren't just quote 7 for fun, they were eating for survival. This is what scientists call the quote 8. It suggests that our attraction to the smell of alcohol, that distinct wafting scent of fermentation, was originally a homing signal. It told our ancestors, quote 9. Imagine the scene, a small band of early hominids moving cautiously through the tall grass. They are hungry, tired, and exposed. Suddenly, the wind carries a pungent, sweet, slightly sharp aroma. It's the smell of a fallen cache of fruit that has been sitting in the sun for days. Their brains, wired by millions of years of selection, light up. This isn't just a meal, it's a high-energy fuel source that will help them survive another day. As they feast, they experience the first subtle effects of ethanol. It's not the roaring intoxication we might think of today, but perhaps a slight relaxation, a dampening of the constant anxiety of life in the wild. And a boost in social bonding. This quote 10 set us on a path that would eventually lead to the vineyards of France, the breweries of Munich, and the pubs of London. But the journey from eating rotten fruit on the ground to intentionally fermenting beverages is a long and complex one. It requires a level of foresight and technological development that wouldn't appear for millions more years. Yet, the foundation was laid. We were the apes who could drink. As we move forward in time, from the Miocene into the Pliocene, and finally the Pleistocene, the human brain begins its miraculous expansion. We see the rise of Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and eventually Homo sapiens. Throughout this time, the environmental pressures that favored the ADH4 mutation remained. But as our ancestors became more intelligent, their relationship with fermented foods likely became more sophisticated. It's easy to imagine that they didn't just stumble upon fermented fruit, but began to recognize the conditions that created it. Perhaps they noticed that fruit left in a hollowed-out stone or a wooden crevice after a rain would quote 12 into something more potent. This is the quote 13 to brewing, a period of observation and opportunistic consumption. There is a growing body of evidence suggesting that quote _14_ were a regular part of the hunter-gatherer diet. From the fermented honey of wild bees to the sap of certain palm trees, the world was full of quote 15_ alcohol. And for a nomadic species constantly on the move, these high-energy substances were prized possessions. But there's another side to this discovery, one that touches on the very nature of human society. Alcohol is and has always been a social lubricant. In the harsh reality of the Stone Age, cooperation was the only way to survive. Anything that could lower the barriers between individuals, encourage sharing, and strengthen the bonds of the tribe would have been incredibly valuable. Some researchers suggest that the shared experience of consuming these rare fermented treats played a role in the development of early rituals. Before there were temples, there were perhaps, quote, 16 or specific sites where fruit was known to ferment perfectly. These could have been the first gathering places, the first spots where different bands of humans met not to fight, but to feast. The quote 17 is that we didn't create alcohol. Alcohol, in a very real biological sense, helped create us. It influenced our move to the ground, it shaped our metabolism, and it likely played a role in our social evolution. We are the descendants of the survivors who could handle their liquor, or at least the fermented fruit that came before it. This challenges the traditional view of history that sees alcohol as a civilized invention. Instead, it's a primal legacy. When we look at the massive megaliths of Gebekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, a site that predates agriculture by thousands of years, we find evidence of massive stone vats that could hold hundreds of gallons of liquid. Chemical analysis has found traces of calcium oxalate, a byproduct of brewing beer. This suggests that the people who built the world's first temple weren't doing it while soberly planting wheat. They were likely gathering in huge numbers, motivated by the promise of a feast that included fermented beverages. It turns the entire quote 20 debate on its head. For decades, historians argued about why humans started farming. Was it to have a steady supply of bread? Or was it to make beer? The emerging evidence suggests that the desire for the quote 21 of fermented drinks might have been the primary driver that pushed us to settle down and start the grueling work of agriculture. We didn't start farming to eat. We started farming to party, and the food was a useful byproduct. But how did we get from those first stone vats at Gebekli Tepe to the complex civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt? How did a biological adaptation for survival turn into a cultural obsession that defined the rise of the first empires? To understand that, we have to look at the chemistry of the liquid gold and how it became the currency of the ancient world. The transition from opportunistic gathering to intentional production marks one of the most significant turning points in the human story. It required an understanding of timing, temperature, and the invisible work of microbes long before anyone knew what a microbe was. It was a form of magic. A bowl of honey water or crushed grapes left alone would begin to bubble and hiss as if possessed by a spirit. And when consumed, it changed the way a person felt, thought, and acted. In the eyes of an early human, this wasn't just chemistry. It was a gift from the gods, or perhaps the gods themselves manifested in liquid form. In this first part of our journey, we've explored the deep genetic roots of our relationship with ethanol.
We've seen how a changing climate and the need for calories drove a specific mutation that changed our destiny. We've looked at the drunken monkey and the first hints of ritualized drinking at the very dawn of human construction. But this is only the beginning. As we move into the next phase of our narrative, we will witness the great fermentation of the Neolithic. We will see how beer became the liquid bread that fueled the building of the pyramids, how wine became the blood of the gods in the Mediterranean, and how the search for even stronger spirits led to the birth of alchemy and the distillation revolution. The story of alcohol is the story of humanity, our ingenuity, our social nature, and our eternal quest for something that transcends the ordinary.
It is a story of surprising discoveries at every turn, where the more we look into the past, the more we realize that our ancestors weren't just, quote, 29 versions of us. In many ways, especially when it came to the, quote, 30, they were far more sophisticated than we ever gave them credit for. Stay with me as we push forward through the millennia, leaving the primordial forests behind and entering the first bustling cities of Sumer and Akkad. The air is about to get a lot more interesting, and the beverages a lot more refined. We are about to discover how a simple survival mechanism became the foundation of global trade, law, and religion. The journey has just begun, and the quote 31 is waiting to be poured. Here is part 2 of the narrative. As the glaciers retreated and the climate warmed, humanity found itself at the precipice of a revolution that would permanently alter the face of the earth. We are now stepping out of the deep shadows of the Paleolithic and into the dawn of the Neolithic, a period where the wild, untamed world slowly began to bend to the will of human ingenuity. The opportunistic scavenging of fermented fallen fruit was no longer enough. The human brain, now fully modern, began to recognize the patterns of the natural world and, more importantly, figure out how to replicate them. But while we often focus on the Middle East as the cradle of civilization, to find the absolute earliest chemical evidence of a deliberately brewed, complex alcoholic beverage, we have to travel thousands of miles east to the Yellow River Valley of ancient China. Here, in a Neolithic village known as Jiahu, dating back an astonishing 9,000 years, archaeologists made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the historical community. Among the remains of bone flutes and early domesticated pigs, they found pottery shards with strange, stubborn residues clinging to their porous clay interiors. When biomolecular archaeologists analyzed these residues, what they found was nothing short of a prehistoric cocktail. The people of Jiahu weren't just fermenting one thing, they were master mixologists of the ancient world. The chemical signature revealed a fermented blend of wild grapes, hawthorn fruit, honey, and rice. It was a mead, a wine, and a beer, all rolled into one potent, intoxicating elixir. This discovery at Jiahu is monumental because it proves that the desire to create alcohol was not a localized phenomenon. It was a universal human imperative that emerged independently across the globe wherever people began to settle down. The people of Jiahu went through immense trouble to gather these specific ingredients, suggesting that this beverage was highly prized, likely central to their religious rituals, their shamanic practices, and their communal feasts. But while the ancient Chinese were brewing mixed fermented beverages, it was in the region of Mesopotamia, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, that alcohol, specifically beer, would become the very bedrock of society. In the scorching heat of the Middle Eastern sun, growing grains like barley and emmer wheat was a grueling, labor-intensive process. As we touched upon earlier, the great debate of bread versus beer continues to rage among anthropologists. But when you look at the evidence from ancient Sumer, the first great urban civilization, the argument leans heavily toward the pint glass. To the Sumerians, beer was not a luxury. It was a fundamental necessity of life, arguably more important than water. And there was a very practical, microscopic reason for this, even if they didn't understand the science behind it. In early agricultural settlements, waste management was practically non-existent. Water sources easily became contaminated with human and animal waste, leading to deadly outbreaks of dysentery and cholera. But the process of making beer requires boiling water to create the mash, and the subsequent fermentation produces alcohol and lowers the pH of the liquid, creating a hostile environment for harmful pathogens. Beer was quite literally safer to drink than water. It was a lifeline. It was nutrition, hydration, and a mild intoxicant, all wrapped in one cloudy, thick liquid. The Sumerian reverence for beer was so profound that they elevated it to the divine. They didn't just have a god of agriculture, they had Ninkasi, the majestic goddess of brewing. One of the most fascinating artifacts ever recovered from the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia is a clay tablet dating back roughly 4,000 years, inscribed with a poem known as the Hymn to Ninkasi. But this was no ordinary poem. It was an ancient, cleverly disguised mnemonic device, a recipe for brewing beer passed down through generations of female brewers. The hymn details the process of baking bapir, a twice-baked barley bread that was heavily infused with dates and honey, which served as the source of fermentable sugars and wild yeast. This bapir was then crumbled into large vats of water, left to ferment, and transformed into a thick, highly nutritious, low-alcohol beer. Because ancient brewing didn't have the modern luxury of filtration, the resulting liquid was basically a fermented porridge, thick with grain husks and floating debris. To drink it without choking on the chaff, the Sumerians invented another crucial piece of technology, the drinking straw. Intricate carvings and cylinder seals from the period depict wealthy Sumerians and royalty sitting together around a large communal ceramic vessel, sipping beer through long reeds, some of which were kept with gold and lapis lazuli to filter out the solids. This act of communal drinking through straws from a single vessel was a powerful social ritual, reinforcing bonds of trust and kinship. You couldn't easily plot against someone when you were literally sharing the same breath, drinking from the same pot. The economic implications of this liquid gold were staggering. As the early cities grew into massive urban centers like Uruk, managing the distribution of resources became a logistical nightmare. How do you pay thousands of laborers, farmers, and artisans in a world before coinage? The answer, naturally, was beer. The earliest known writing system in the world, cuneiform, did not emerge to record poetry, epic myths, or the histories of kings. It was invented by accountants. It was created to keep track of grain silos, livestock, and, above all, beer rations. Some of the oldest clay tablets ever translated are essentially pay stubs, recording the exact amount of beer owed to workers. The symbol for beer, an upright jar with a pointed base, appears constantly in these early administrative records. Different classes of workers received different qualities and quantities of beer. A standard laborer might receive a couple of liters of a weak, cloudy brew per day, while senior officials and high priests were allotted premium, strong beers sweetened with excessive amounts of dates. In a very real sense, beer was the currency that built civilization. It provided the caloric energy necessary for grueling manual labor, the economic incentive to work within a stratified societal system, and the social lubrication needed to keep thousands of people crammed into a walled city from killing each other. And if beer was the currency of Mesopotamia, it was the absolute lifeblood of ancient Egypt. The Egyptians took the art of brewing and scaled it up to industrial proportions. To the Egyptians, beer, known as henket, was a staple consumed by everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the pharaoh himself. It was consumed at every meal, offered to the gods in massive quantities, and buried with the dead to ensure they wouldn't go thirsty in the afterlife. The Egyptian brewing process was slightly different from the Sumerian, often utilizing heavily malted wheat and a different type of yeast strain, resulting in a brew that was likely a bit more sour and fruity, reminiscent of modern lambics or sour ales. But beyond daily sustenance, beer in Egypt was responsible for the greatest architectural achievements of the ancient world. The Great Pyramids of Giza were not built by slaves, as Hollywood would have you believe. They were built by respected, skilled laborers and farmers who worked during the flood season when their fields were underwater. And how were these colossal workforces compensated for moving millions of tons of limestone under the blistering African sun? They were paid in bread and beer. Archaeological excavations at the workers' village on the Giza Plateau have uncovered massive industrial-scale bakeries and breweries capable of producing thousands of gallons of beer every single week. The daily ration for a pyramid builder was roughly 4 to 5 liters of a thick, nutritious beer. It provided the hydration to survive the desert heat and the carbohydrates to fuel their exhausting labor. Without the invention of large-scale brewing, the pyramids simply could not have been built. The profound connection between the ancient Egyptians and their alcohol is perhaps best illustrated by one of their most dramatic and violent myths, the story of the goddess Sekhmet. According to the legend, the sun god Ra had grown tired of humanity's constant rebellion and sin. In his wrath, he plucked out his own eye, which transformed into the fierce, lion-headed goddess Sekhmet, and sent her down to earth to punish mankind. Sekhmet began a terrifying rampage, slaughtering humans by the thousands and wading through rivers of their blood. Ra, realizing that his enforcer was going to completely exterminate the human race, decided he needed to stop her. But Sekhmet was too powerful, completely consumed by her bloodlust. So Ra devised a cunning plan. He ordered his high priests to brew a massive quantity of beer, 7,000 jars of it, according to some texts. He then had them mix the beer with red ochre or pomegranate juice until it perfectly resembled the color of human blood. They poured this massive crimson lake of beer onto the fields where Sekhmet was rampaging. When the fierce lion goddess saw the red liquid, she assumed it was the blood of her victims and greedily drank it all. The alcohol hit her incredibly fast. She became violently intoxicated, eventually passing out in a deep, drunken slumber. When she awoke, her bloodlust was gone, and she transformed into the gentle, benevolent goddess Hathor. Humanity was saved, entirely thanks to the power of a good, strong brew. To commemorate this event, the ancient Egyptians held an annual Quote 36, where consuming vast quantities of alcohol was not just permitted, but a sacred religious duty to honor the goddess who was tricked by a hangover. While beer reigned supreme in the floodplains of Egypt and Mesopotamia, a different kind of alchemy was taking place in the cooler, rugged terrains of the Mediterranean and the Caucasus. This was the birth of wine, a beverage that would eventually conquer the Western world and become entangled with the very concepts of philosophy, democracy, and empire. If beer was the drink of the masses, the reliable fuel of the worker, wine was destined to become the nectar of the elite, the drink of the philosopher and the aristocrat. The story of wine begins in the rugged mountains of what is now modern-day Georgia, roughly 8,000 years ago. Here, the native Vitis vinifera grape grew wild and abundant. The early inhabitants of the Caucasus realized that these grapes, naturally dusted with wild yeast on their skins, required almost no effort to ferment. They didn't need to bake bread or heat massive cauldrons of water. They simply had to crush the grapes, leave them in a vessel, and let nature take its course. The Georgians perfected a method of winemaking that they still use today, utilizing massive clay vessels called kvevri. These giant, teardrop-shaped terracotta pots were lined with beeswax, filled with crushed grapes, skins, stems, and all, and then buried deep underground to regulate the temperature during fermentation. The resulting wine was robust, highly tannic, and heavily intoxicating. From the Caucasus Mountains, the secret of the wine spread slowly south and west, sweeping through the Levant and eventually taking root in the rocky soil of ancient Greece. The Greeks didn't just adopt wine, they wove it into the very fabric of their cultural identity. To the Greeks, wine was the defining characteristic of a civilized man. In a world surrounded by so-called, quote, 38, who drank the cloudy, unrefined beer of the north and east, the Greeks saw their clear, potent wine as a mark of superior intellect and divine favor. They worshipped Dionysus, the god of the grape harvest, winemaking, and ritual madness. Dionysus was a complex, terrifying deity, embodying both the liberating, creative power of alcohol and its destructive, chaotic potential. The Greeks understood implicitly that the liquid in their amphorae was a double-edged sword. It could loosen the tongue and inspire brilliant philosophical discourse, but it could just as easily reduce a man to an animalistic state. To manage this potent force, the Greeks formalized a consumption of alcohol through an institution known as the, quote, 39. The Symposium was essentially an aristocratic drinking party, but it was heavily structured and governed by strict rules. The men would recline on couches surrounded by music, poetry, and debate. But the most important figure in the room was the quote, 40 the master of ceremonies. It was his job to determine the ratio of wine to water for the evening. You see, the ancient Greeks considered it utterly barbaric to drink wine. Quote, 41 or unmixed. Their wine was likely a thick, syrupy, high-alcohol concentrate that needed to be diluted. The symposiarch would mix the wine and water in a large, central bowl called a crater. If he wanted a night of serious philosophical debate, he would mix a weak ratio, perhaps 3 parts water to 1 part wine. If he wanted a wild, raucous party that would end in revelry and chaos, he would mix it half and half. The Symposium became the crucible of Greek culture, the place where political alliances were forged, where the poetry of Homer was recited, and where the foundations of Western philosophy were debated, all fueled by the careful, deliberate consumption of alcohol. As the influence of Greece waned and the shadow of the Roman Empire stretched across the known world, wine went from being a regional specialty to a massive, globalized industry. The Romans took the Greek appreciation for wine and applied their terrifyingly efficient engineering and logistical skills to it. They planted vineyards across the entirety of their empire, from the sun-drenched hills of Iberia to the gloomy, rain-swept valleys of Roman Britain. The demand for wine in the city of Rome alone was staggering. Millions of liters flowed into the capital every year, transported in massive clay amphorae stacked in the hulls of specialized trading ships. The Romans categorized their wines with the same obsession that modern sommeliers do today, recognizing specific vintages, regional terroirs, and the differences between a cheap, sour tavern wine given to slaves and the legendary Falernian, a sweet, potent white wine that was aged for decades and prized by emperors. But this massive, ancient global trade in alcohol was not without its dark side. The pursuit of the perfect drink often led to dangerous, even deadly innovations. To sweeten their wines and preserve them for long journeys across the Mediterranean, Roman winemakers began boiling grape must in lead vessels. This process created a syrup called quote, 42 which was incredibly sweet but heavily contaminated with lead acetate, also known as quote, 43 . This toxic sweetener was added to countless batches of Roman wine, particularly the cheaper varieties consumed by the masses. Some historians have even wildly speculated that widespread lead poisoning, fueled by heavily contaminated wine, contributed to the erratic behavior of the Roman elite and the eventual decline and fall of the Roman Empire itself. While the truth is likely far more complex, it highlights a crucial point. Humanity's love affair with alcohol has always been a dangerous dance. We have constantly pushed the boundaries of chemistry and agriculture to satisfy our ancient primate urge for that fermented buzz, sometimes with catastrophic results. As the classical world crumbled and Europe descended into the early Middle Ages, the grand, state-sponsored vineyards of Rome fell into ruin. The trade routes shattered, and the massive industrial-scale production of alcohol ground to a halt. But the knowledge was not lost. It retreated behind the thick stone walls of monasteries.
The monks, recognizing the importance of wine for the Christian sacrament of the Eucharist, became the new guardians of the vine. They meticulously studied the soil, perfected pruning techniques, and kept the science of fermentation alive through the dark centuries. Meanwhile, in the cold northern reaches of Europe, where grapes could not grow, the ancient tradition of beer brewing continued unabated in the hearts of peasant homes. But a new discovery was looming on the horizon. A technological leap that would take the natural magic of fermentation and amplify it to terrifying new heights. The age of simple beers and wines was ending. The era of burning water, of spirits and distillation was about to begin. The shift from natural fermentation to the deliberate concentration of alcohol represents one of the most profound and arguably dangerous technological leaps in human history.
For millions of years, our ancestors, and later our civilized forebears, were constrained by the biological limits of yeast. Wild yeasts, the microscopic workhorses of fermentation, can only survive in environments with an alcohol concentration of roughly 15 to 18% at the absolute maximum. Once the alcohol level rises beyond this threshold, the environment becomes toxic to the yeast itself, the organisms die, and the fermentation process naturally halts. This meant that the strongest wines of ancient Rome, or the most potent meads of the Vikings, still had a biological ceiling. But human curiosity is a relentless force. We were not satisfied with what nature provided. We wanted to extract the very soul of the drink, the pure, unadulterated essence of intoxication. The key to unlocking this potent force did not come from a winemaker or a brewer, but from the esoteric and mystical world of early chemistry, specifically the laboratories of the Islamic Golden Age. During the 8th and 9th centuries, while Europe was languishing in the intellectual stagnation of the Dark Ages, scholars in the Middle East were making unprecedented leaps in science, mathematics, and medicine. Among these brilliant minds was a Persian alchemist named Jabir ibn Hayyan, often known in the West as Geber. Jabir was obsessed with the concept of purification, the idea that you could separate the pure, essential properties of a substance from its gross, earthly matter. To achieve this, he perfected a device known as the alembic still. The concept of distillation relies on a brilliantly simple principle of physics. Ethanol, the alcohol we drink, has a lower boiling point than water. While water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, ethanol vaporizes at roughly 78 degrees Celsius. By taking a fermented liquid like wine and gently heating it in an enclosed copper or glass vessel, the alcohol turns into vapor before the water does. This invisible, highly flammable vapor rises into the neck of the alembic, travels through a cooling tube where it condenses back into a liquid, and drips out the other side. What emerges is no longer wine or beer. It is a concentrated, fiery spirit. The Arabic word for this process of condensation, al-anbik, gave us the word alembic, and the dark powdered cosmetics they distilled using similar methods, al-kul, eventually gave us the word alcohol. Initially, these powerful new liquids were not meant for casual drinking. They were far too potent, burning the throat and overwhelming the senses. Instead, they were viewed through the lens of medicine and magic. When the secret of distillation eventually trickled into Christian Europe, brought back by scholars and returning crusaders, it was embraced by monks and apothecaries. They called this clear, burning liquid aqua vitae, the water of life. And in the 14th century, when the catastrophic shadow of the Black Death fell over Europe, wiping out roughly a third of the population, people turned to aqua vitae in sheer, terrifying desperation. The bubonic plague was completely misunderstood. People believed it was spread by miasma or bad air. Physicians and plague doctors, donning their terrifying bird-like masks, would soak rags in distilled spirits infused with potent herbs like juniper and rosemary, holding them to their faces to ward off the sickness. People drank the burning liquid, believing it could purify their blood and drive out the demonic pestilence. While it did absolutely nothing to cure the plague, the sheer intoxicating power of the high-proof alcohol provided a temporary, numbing escape from the apocalyptic horrors surrounding them. This era forged an indelible link in the human psyche between distilled spirits and medicine, a legacy that survives every time someone suggests a hot toddy for a cold or a shot of whiskey for a toothache. As Europe eventually emerged from the devastation of the plague, the continent looked outward, launching the age of exploration. The great wooden galleons of Spain, Portugal, England, and the Netherlands began to push beyond the familiar waters of the Mediterranean, seeking new trade routes to the spices of the East and the unimaginable wealth of the New World. But these massive oceanic voyages presented a terrifying logistical nightmare. How do you keep a crew of hundreds of men hydrated for months at sea when fresh water stored in wooden casks turns rancid and slimy with algae within weeks? The traditional answer had been beer or weak wine, but even these would sour and turn to vinegar over a long, hot voyage. The solution lay in the alembic still. By distilling massive quantities of wine into a concentrated spirit, sailors created a liquid that was practically immune to spoilage. The high alcohol content created a completely sterile environment where no bacteria could survive. The Dutch, who dominated global shipping, called this concentrated, heat-treated beverage brandewijn, meaning burnt wine, which the English quickly shortened to brandy. Spirits became the essential fuel of global maritime expansion. The sails of the great galleons may have been pushed by the trade winds, but the men who rigged those sails were propelled by daily rations of high-proof alcohol. However, the intersection of distillation, maritime exploration, and decolonization of the Americas soon gave rise to one of the darkest and most brutal chapters in human history, fueled by a completely new, terrifyingly potent spirit: rum.
When European powers established colonies in the Caribbean and South America, they discovered the perfect climate for growing sugarcane, a crop that yielded massive profits back in Europe. But sugar production is an incredibly labor-intensive and brutal process. To maximize their profits, European empires turned to the transatlantic slave trade, kidnapping millions of people from the African continent and forcing them into horrific, back-breaking labor on the sugar plantations. The process of refining sugarcane into crystalline sugar produces a thick, dark, syrupy byproduct known as molasses. Initially, plantation owners didn't know what to do with this massive amount of sticky industrial waste. They tried feeding it to livestock, and they even dumped it into the ocean. But eventually, someone, likely the enslaved Africans themselves, drawing on ancient knowledge of wild fermentation, discovered that if you mix molasses with water and leave it in the tropical heat, it ferments rapidly into a harsh, potent beer. When plantation owners realized they could take this fermented molasses waste and run it through a copper still, the resulting spirit was an absolute revelation. It was a vicious, fiery, and incredibly cheap liquor. The early versions were so harsh that they were colloquially known as, quote, 50. But it was highly intoxicating and it lasted forever. Rum quickly became the economic lubricant of the transatlantic triangle trade. Ships would leave Europe laden with manufactured goods and weapons, which they would trade in West Africa for enslaved people. These men, women and children were transported under nightmare conditions across the Middle Passage to the Caribbean, where they were sold to sugar plantations. The ships would then load up with massive hogsheads of sugar and rum, returning to Europe or the North American colonies to sell the cargo for a massive profit, starting the brutal cycle all over again. Rum was literally used as a currency to buy human lives. The insatiable demand for this cheap, high-proof spirit fueled the expansion of the plantation system, directly contributing to the suffering and death of millions. It is a sobering reminder that our primal, evolutionary drive for alcohol, when combined with industrial technology and unchecked greed, can lead to catastrophic human exploitation. While rum was devastating the lives of the enslaved, it was simultaneously forging the identity of the British Royal Navy. The waters of the Caribbean were infested with pirates and privateers, and maintaining order required a massive naval presence. The British Admiralty quickly realized that giving sailors a daily ration of half a pint of overproof rum, which was around 57% alcohol by volume, was a recipe for total chaos. Sailors would hoard their rations, drink them all at once, and end up dangerously intoxicated, leading to mutinies, fatal falls from the rigging, and completely botched naval maneuvers. In 1740, an admiral named Edward Vernon, affectionately known as __quote _51__ because of his waterproof Grogram coat, issued a brilliant, world-changing order. He mandated that the daily rum ration must be mixed with a quart of water before being distributed, and he suggested the men add sugar and lime juice to make it more palatable. This diluted mixture became known as __quote _52__. Vernon's intention was simply to force the sailors to drink more water and prevent them from getting blindly drunk, but he accidentally stumbled upon a medical miracle.
The addition of fresh citrus juice provided a massive dose of vitamin C, practically eliminating scurvy, a horrific, agonizing disease that regularly decimated naval crews from the British fleet. While the French and Spanish navies were crippled by sickness on long voyages, the British sailors remained relatively healthy, giving them a massive tactical advantage that helped secure British naval supremacy for over a century. Once again, alcohol, this time heavily modified and weaponized, altered the course of global empires. But the true, terrifying consequence of unlocking the secret of distillation would not be fully realized until it hit the densely populated, rapidly industrializing cities of Europe, creating the first modern public health crisis. The stage was set in early 18th century London, a city exploding in population as people abandoned the countryside to seek work in the grinding poverty of urban slums. In an effort to boost the local economy and spite their French rivals who exported brandy, the British government drastically reduced the taxes on distilling grain spirits and allowed practically anyone to set up a still in their home. The result was an absolute catastrophe known to history as the gin craze. Londoners, particularly the desperately poor who were living in squalid, freezing and disease-ridden conditions, suddenly had access to an ocean of incredibly cheap, highly intoxicating and often heavily adulterated gin. It was no longer the artisanal aqua vitae of the monks. It was industrial-scale poison. Some gin was even cut with sulfuric acid or turpentine to give it a stronger kick. The impact on the social fabric of London was devastating. The human brain, which, as we know, evolved to handle the mild buzz of naturally fermented fruit, was completely overwhelmed by the constant availability of 40% and 50% alcohol. It was the drunken monkey hypothesis taken to a horrifying dystopian extreme. Instead of signaling a rare high-calorie meal, the smell of gin signaled oblivion. Men and women abandoned their jobs and their families, prioritizing the cheap escape of the spirit over basic survival. Infant mortality skyrocketed as destitute mothers either neglected their children or, tragically, fed them gin to quiet their crying. The famous engraving by William Hogarth, Gin Lane, visually captured this apocalyptic despair, depicting a chaotic urban nightmare where buildings collapse, the starving fight over scraps, and a syphilis-ridden mother drops her baby down a stairwell while reaching for another pinch of snuff and a glass of gin. The signage in the gin shops famously advertised, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for tuppence, clean straw for nothing." The gin craze forced the government to realize that alcohol was no longer just a biological imperative or an economic tool. It was a highly dangerous, addictive substance that required strict regulation. The state had to step in with draconian laws to forcibly reduce the consumption of spirits, fundamentally changing the relationship between the citizen, the government, and the bottle. As we stand at the threshold of the modern era, leaving the soot-stained streets of Gin Lane behind, we can see how far we have strayed from the sun-dappled forests of the Miocene. What began as a miraculous genetic mutation, a tiny tweak in our DNA that allowed our ape ancestors to survive a changing climate by consuming rotting fruit, has spiraled into a complex, globe-spanning obsession. We have witnessed alcohol serve as the foundation of early human cooperation, the currency of ancient civilizations, the holy sacrament of expanding religions and the dark fuel of maritime conquest and exploitation. Our biological hardwiring, designed to seek out this potent source of calories and social bonding, has been continuously hacked and exploited by our own technological brilliance. We learned to capture the magic of yeast, and then we learned to bypass it entirely, distilling spirits that our Paleolithic bodies were never meant to process in such massive quantities. The story of humanity's relationship with alcohol is a perfect mirror of the human condition itself. It is a story of immense creativity, the profound desire for connection, and the terrifying capacity for self-destruction. As we move into the final chapters of our epic narrative, we will explore the great pushback, the rise of the temperance movements, the bizarre and violent era of Prohibition, and the modern scientific understanding of exactly what this ancient molecule does to our highly evolved brains. We will ask the ultimate question. After 10 million years of chasing the buzz, from the jungle floor to the neon-lit bars of the 21st century, is alcohol our greatest friend, our worst enemy, or simply a biological destiny we can never truly escape? The answers, much like a perfectly aged vintage, are complex, full of contradictions, and waiting to be uncorked. The transition from the agrarian rhythms of the past to the relentless, unforgiving pace of the Industrial Revolution fundamentally broke humanity's long-standing, somewhat balanced relationship with alcohol. For millennia, whether you were a Sumerian farmer, an Egyptian pyramid builder, or a medieval peasant, your alcohol consumption was naturally paced by the seasons, the availability of ingredients, and the rising and setting of the sun. But as the 19th century dawned, the world was engulfed in smoke, steel, and steam. The invention of the continuous column still, a massive industrial marvel that could produce high-proof, incredibly pure, neutral spirits non-stop, 24 hours a day, flooded the expanding cities of Europe and the Americas with a tidal wave of cheap liquor. Suddenly, the quote, _57 was no longer foraging in a forest. He was trapped in a concrete jungle, working brutal 14-hour shifts in textile mills and coal mines, surrounded by an unlimited supply of highly concentrated ethanol. In this harsh new reality, the ancient social lubricant became a highly destructive force. The drunken worker was no longer just a slow or sloppy worker. In the context of massive, exposed gears, roaring furnaces, and automated looms, an intoxicated worker was a mortal danger to himself and everyone around him. Furthermore, the sheer misery of the urban slums drove people to seek the quickest, most potent chemical escape possible. The local tavern or pub replaced the church and the village square as the center of social life. But it was a life often characterized by squalor, domestic violence, and financial ruin. It was in this grim crucible that society began to experience a profound moral and cultural backlash. If alcohol was the ancient fire that helped forge human civilization, the 19th century saw that fire rage out of control, prompting a desperate effort to extinguish it completely. This was the birth of the Temperance Movement, a powerful grassroots crusade that would ultimately culminate in one of the most spectacular and disastrous social experiments in human history. Initially, temperance advocates did not want to ban alcohol entirely. They merely preached moderation, urging people to abandon the harsh industrial spirits and return to the natural, low-alcohol beer and wine of their ancestors. But as the social devastation of alcoholism became more visible, the movement radicalized. Driven heavily by religious organizations and, crucially, by women who bore the devastating brunt of alcohol-fueled domestic abuse and financial abandonment, temperance morphed into a demand for absolute prohibition. Figures like the terrifying and legendary Carrie Nation in the United States took matters into their own hands, marching into saloons with a Bible in one hand and a hatchet in the other, physically smashing whiskey barrels and shattering mirrors in a righteous, violent fury. The message was clear. The quote 58 was an existential threat to the family, to productivity, and to the very soul of modern civilization. This moral panic, combined with the xenophobic political climate of World War I, where the massive German-American brewing conglomerates were suddenly viewed with intense suspicion, created the perfect storm. In 1920, the United States government enacted the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, plunging the nation into the era of Prohibition. It was a staggering legislative attempt to completely rewrite human biology and sociology by decree. The manufacturing, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors were entirely banned across the country. For a brief, shining moment, the temperance crusaders believed they had won. They thought they had finally cured society of its ancient primate weakness, but they severely underestimated the power of 10 million years of evolutionary hardwiring. You cannot simply legislate away a biological drive that is woven into the very fabric of human DNA. Almost overnight, the demand for alcohol did not disappear. It simply went completely underground, creating a massive, untaxed, and highly dangerous black market. The era of the quote 59 was born. Behind unmarked doors, down dark alleyways, and behind false walls, in seemingly legitimate businesses, millions of Americans continued to drink. But the nature of the drink had changed. Because smuggling bulky barrels of low-alcohol beer was completely impractical and highly risky, the black market prioritized the most concentrated, high-proof spirits possible. Bootleggers and organized crime syndicates, famously led by ruthless figures like Al Capone in Chicago, built massive empires on the illegal distribution of liquor. To maximize profits and stretch their supplies, these illicit spirits were often made in hidden, unsanitary stills. Hence, the term quote 60 and frequently cut with terrifying industrial chemicals like methanol or embalming fluid. Tens of thousands of people went permanently blind, suffered severe neurological damage, or died from drinking poisoned bootleg liquor. Prohibition was a catastrophic failure because it created an environment far more dangerous than the one it sought to cure. It turned millions of ordinary citizens into criminals, corrupted entire police forces and political systems with massive bribes, and birthed the modern era of organized crime. By 1933, amidst the devastating economic crush of the Great Depression, the government realized that the quote 61 had failed spectacularly. The 21st Amendment was passed, repealing Prohibition and bringing alcohol back into the light of legal regulation and taxation. But the legacy of Prohibition left a permanent scar on the cultural psyche, proving once and for all that our relationship with alcohol is so deeply entrenched that trying to sever it by force will only result in chaos. So why is this drive so incredibly powerful? Why were people willing to risk blindness, imprisonment, and death just to get a drink? To answer that, we have to leave the history books behind and take a microscopic journey into the most complex structure in the known universe: the human brain. Modern neuroscience has finally provided the exact chemical mechanism behind the magic of the __quote_ 62 __, explaining precisely why that ADH4 mutation in our ancient ancestors felt so incredibly rewarding. When you take a sip of an alcoholic beverage, the ethanol molecules are so incredibly small that they easily pass through the blood-brain barrier, a biological filter that usually protects our grey matter from foreign substances. Once inside the brain, ethanol acts as a highly effective pharmacological wrecking ball, simultaneously interacting with several different neurotransmitter systems. First, ethanol binds to the receptors for a chemical called GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid. GABA is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. Its job is to slow down brain activity, reduce anxiety, and promote relaxation. Alcohol acts as a massive amplifier for GABA, turning down the volume on the brain's internal chatter. This is why that first drink after a stressful day feels like a deep neurological sigh of relief. It suppresses the fear and anxiety centers of the amygdala, making us feel suddenly courageous and unbothered. Simultaneously, alcohol suppresses glutamate, the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter. By blocking glutamate, alcohol further slows down our reaction times, slurs our speech, and clouds our judgment. But if alcohol was merely a depressant, we would just fall asleep. The true addictive magic lies in its interaction with the brain's reward circuitry. As the ethanol floods the system, it triggers a massive release of dopamine and endorphins, the brain's natural feel-good chemicals, in a region called the nucleus accumbens. This is the exact same reward pathway that lights up when we eat high-calorie foods, have sex, or successfully survive a dangerous encounter. Remember the drunken monkey? Millions of years ago, finding rotting, fermented fruit meant survival. The brain evolved to reward that behavior with a massive spike of dopamine, essentially screaming, "Yes, do that again, you are surviving." Today, when you sit at a bar and drink a highly refined cocktail, your brain is reacting with the exact same primal software. It believes you have just struck a survival jackpot. You are getting the massive dopamine reward of surviving a famine without actually doing any of the work. This evolutionary mismatch is the root of addiction. For some individuals, due to a complex matrix of genetics, trauma, and environment, that dopamine spike is so overwhelmingly powerful that it hijacks their entire motivational system, leading to the devastating cycle of alcoholism. We are essentially Paleolithic creatures navigating a modern world armed with dangerous distilled chemistry that our ancient brains are completely unequipped to handle. Fascinatingly, while the ADH4 mutation 10 million years ago universally allowed our ancestors to process alcohol, human evolution did not stop there. The story of alcohol and genetics has a surprising modern chapter that occurred entirely independent of the drunken monkey. Roughly 10,000 years ago, around the exact same time, the people of Jiahu were brewing their prehistoric rice mead in ancient China, a completely new genetic mutation appeared in East Asian populations. This mutation affected a different enzyme, ALDH2, aldehyde dehydrogenase 2, which is responsible for the second stage of breaking down alcohol in the liver. When your body processes ethanol, it first turns it into a highly toxic carcinogenic substance called acetaldehyde. A normal ALDH2 enzyme quickly breaks this toxic substance down into harmless acetate. But for people with the ALDH2 mutation, the enzyme is virtually inactive. When individuals with this mutation drink alcohol, the toxic acetaldehyde rapidly builds up in their bloodstream. This triggers a massive release of histamine, causing the blood vessels to dilate, resulting in a deep red flushing of the face and neck, accompanied by a rapid heart rate, nausea, and a throbbing headache. This phenomenon, commonly known as the Asian flush or alcohol flush reaction, affects hundreds of millions of people today, primarily of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean descent. But from an evolutionary standpoint, this is an incredibly fascinating development. Why would a mutation that makes drinking physically miserable become so widespread? Some geneticists theorize that it was an evolutionary defense mechanism. In an era where early rice agriculture was producing vast amounts of easy-to-brew alcohol, perhaps the flush reaction served as a biological stop sign, protecting the population from the devastating social and health impacts of mass alcoholism. It is a stunning example of human biology acting as an internal prohibition agent, proving that the evolutionary dance between humanity and alcohol is still ongoing. As we stand in the present day, our relationship with the liquid gold is more complex, nuanced, and, frankly, confusing than ever before. We live in an era of massive extremes. On one hand, the global alcohol industry is a staggering multi-trillion-dollar behemoth. Massive multinational conglomerates pump out billions of gallons of standardized, aggressively marketed lagers and spirits. Yet, simultaneously, there has been a massive grassroots revival of ancient brewing techniques. Craft brewers are resurrecting Sumerian beer recipes. Winemakers are returning to the ancient Georgian qvevri buried in the earth. And mixologists are foraging for wild, Paleolithic ingredients to craft hyperlocal, historically accurate cocktails. We are, in many ways, desperately trying to reconnect with the artisanal, ritualistic roots of our drinking culture, rebelling against the soulless, industrial homogenization of the modern era. Yet, there is another, perhaps more profound shift happening right now. For the first time in modern history, a massive, sober, curious movement is sweeping across younger generations. Armed with detailed neurological data about the toxic effects of ethanol, the carcinogenic nature of acetaldehyde, and the severe disruption alcohol causes to sleep and mental health, millions of people are actively choosing to opt out of the evolutionary imperative. The market for high-quality, complex, non-alcoholic beers, zero-proof botanical spirits, and functional mocktails is exploding. We are finally asking ourselves a difficult question. Can we have the ritual, the social bonding, and the sophisticated flavor profiles of the Symposium without the devastating biological tax of the ethanol molecule? The future of the surprising discovery may lie in the laboratories of modern pharmacologists who are currently racing to develop synthetic alcohol alternatives. Scientists like Professor David Nutt in the UK have been working on compounds such as Alcarel designed to specifically target the brain's GABA receptors to mimic the exact relaxing, socially lubricating effects of the first two drinks, but completely bypassing the toxic liver metabolism and the dangerous dopamine hijacking that leads to addiction and hangovers. If successful, it would be the ultimate hack of our primate biology. We would finally separate the social spark from the poison. We would conquer the liquid that has conquered us for millennia. Let us pull back all the way out and look at the vast, sprawling tapestry of this 10 million year journey. The story of alcohol is not a simple history of a beverage. It is the fundamental story of what it means to be human. It is a narrative that begins in the humid canopy of a shrinking African forest, where a starving ape caught the scent of fermenting fruit on the wind and made a choice that permanently altered the trajectory of life on Earth. That single, desperate act of survival ignited a chain reaction that would echo through eternity. It pushed us to the ground. It fueled our caloric expansion. It provided the social glue that allowed us to gather around the first fires, turning isolated individuals into cohesive, cooperative tribes. As we grew in intelligence, we harnessed the invisible magic of the microbes, capturing the fermenting yeast in clay pots and stone vats. We built the first great temples at Gebekli Tepe to celebrate the harvest of the brew. We inscribed the first words in human history on clay tablets to ensure the fair distribution of beer in the shadow of the ziggurats. We built the towering pyramids of Giza on a foundation of fermented grain. We philosophized in the courtyards of Athens over watered-down wine, and we expanded empires across the globe fueled by the fiery, distilled water of life. We have also suffered immensely for this ancient love affair. We have enslaved, poisoned, and destroyed ourselves in the relentless pursuit of the perfect buzz, constantly battling the dark, addictive shadow of our own neurochemistry. The surprising discovery is that we are not separate from nature. We are deeply, biologically entangled with it. Every time you raise a glass, whether it is a crystal flute of vintage champagne at a wedding, a cheap pint of ale in a noisy pub, or a meticulously crafted non-alcoholic botanical elixir, you are participating in an unbroken 10 million year old ritual. You are echoing the actions of the hominid on the forest floor. You are repeating the incantations of the Sumerian brewers and the Greek symposiarchs. You are feeling the exact same chemical cascade that provided solace to the pyramid builders and the plague doctors. Alcohol did not just accompany us on our journey from the caves to the cosmos, it actively shaped the path. It is the liquid mirror reflecting our greatest triumphs, our deepest flaws, our relentless ingenuity, and our profound need to connect with one another in a harsh and terrifying universe. We are, and always have been, the apes who drank. And as we look toward the future, whatever forms our celebrations, our rituals, and our social gatherings may take, the ghost of that ancient fermented fruit will forever linger in our DNA.